And we are here with another episode of Tidal Flooding Talk, brought to you by the New Jersey Coastal Coalition in conjunction with our broadcast partners at Triax 57 News. It is just the guys today, at least on the host side. We have Dan Skeldon here. Palma Shiles, unfortunately, cannot be with us for this episode or the next episode, but she's fine. We'll be back with her in a few weeks. Dan, we are in the midst of September here. It's been on the cooler side here in New Jersey and most of the mid-Atlantic. I'm hoping October maybe becomes the September we didn't have, because September is feeling like October.
Yeah, well, welcome to astronomical fall, right? So we're just in the official fall season, and we can have warm late Septembers, early Octobers, and if you're not ready to say goodbye to summer just yet. The first half of September, eerily quiet in the tropics, which of course is good news. Less hurricanes, the better. I'm a little fearful though that do we make up for the quiet, the tranquility now with an active second half of the season? I guess time will tell on that front.
Yeah, I mean, the peak of hurricane season, September 10th. And on September 10th, we had no storms in the tropical Atlantic for the first time since 2016. And I believe there was only 5 times since 1984. So you're talking like 43 years, we've only had it 5 times. So it is unusual. I don't know if it means anything, but it is unusual. But hopefully, to Dan's point, we do not have any hurricanes as we go into the second half of hurricane season. I think someone else who hopes we don't have hurricanes in the second half of hurricane season is our guest for today. She is in Ocean City, New Jersey, right along the coast here. We have Kylie Price. She's a journalist for Inside Climate News. We are having her on today because she wrote a really interesting article. Wildfire burn scars can exaggerate flooding. So, when I think of flooding, you're thinking of wet, rainy, right? What does that have to do with fire, which is usually dry and, all that kind of stuff. But she's going to connect the dots for us here. First off, welcome to the show, Kylie. And we are fully immersed in local summer. I'm sure you're loving it down the shore.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Like you guys were saying, though, it does not feel like any type of summer right now. So that changes a bit.
No, we've been below average pretty much since the beginning of August. Some people are loving it. I think more people are liking it, but I think you and me are on the same boat. We want a little bit of, beach weather in our lives before we really start getting to November and December. All right. So let's just start this off the top. I mean, what inspired you, or what gave you the idea to write about what seems like these two opposites of each other, fire and flooding?
Right. Yeah. They may sound like opposites, but they're way more intertwined than you might first think. And we can get into that a bit. But the inspiration for this piece was actually a situation that happened in New Mexico. So a little bit earlier in the summer, there was a situation where there was really extreme flash flooding in a town, and it swept away certain houses, and some people were injured. And part of the reason for that flood being so bad was because of a burn scar, which it basically describes an area of land that has been burned by a wildfire. But that burn scar was actually from a full year prior. And this region is susceptible to things like flash floods. But the burn scar has made flash flooding worse in this particular area. So I thought it was really interesting to maybe try to get into a bit of the science behind why this was happening.
And Kylie, where would this, would this be a concern where obviously, like, kind of what are the ingredients needed to make this occur? And I guess geographically, where would this be more prone to occur in the United States? Obviously, somewhere where wildfires are rampant, and maybe where flash flooding and river flooding are rampant too.
Yes. So yeah, it's pretty interesting dynamics when you get down to it, which I'm sure both of you understand. When it comes to weather and things like that, there are so many factors in an ecosystem or a different location that might influence this. New Mexico and the surrounding region are more susceptible to heavy amounts of rain all at once. So I think people think dry when they think desert, which is true a lot of the time. But then there's also a monsoon season, and there are these flash flood risks already. So I think that that's one thing, is just having this really heavy rain all at once. And then another thing is having more wildfire prone regions. That can be a bigger risk. And the thing about this dynamic is the intensity of the fire as well. So some of these fires can get incredibly hot, like up to 1,000 degrees. And that kind of plays into a bit of the science. Am I able to get into the kind of nerdy talk?
Do it.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, great. Yeah, so basically, when a fire burns that hot in a certain type of soil, it can actually change the chemistry of the soil. It forms this waxy layer, and that's partially because it's burning that biomass, is what it's called. So all that litter or detritus on top of the soil, that we have as well in New Jersey, it can burn that at such an extreme temperature that it creates this waxy layer, and that waxy layer is actually repelling water. So normally when it would absorb water, that can help in the scenario of something like an extreme rainfall or something like that. In this case, the soil is actually repelling it. So that can be really risky when you have this dumping of rain. It's almost helping along with the process. And then I think the biggest risk with damage on this front is in more of a mountainous area. So the situation in New Mexico, you can imagine, okay, almost like a slip and slide of water coming down. And it comes down so quickly, it can even reach speeds up to like a freight train. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So, and you said detritus. I think that was a big word. That was a little too nerdy for me on that one.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no. Well, we love it. You did use New Mexico as the example, in this story. I'm assuming that this is something, you said mountainous terrain. Is this something we could see a little bit closer to the East Coast? Meaning, could we see this in the Appalachian Mountains as well?
Yeah, different. It basically all comes down to the soil too. Certain soils they can get this hot and they kind of exhibit the same type of like hydrophobic property. I feel like I'm getting a little scientist right now.
We're all
Yeah,
scientists here.
yeah, yeah. It's fun. It's like teaching a class. Yeah, it can definitely happen around here. And in New Jersey, fire is a part of certain ecosystems in New Jersey. And that's a natural part too in a lot of scenarios. With climate change, scientists are finding that fires are becoming more intense. So basically more severe. And that's where you creep into this space of if they get too hot, then they can change this soil property. And I was looking into a bit more of the research specifically with the Pine Barrens. The soil's a little bit different here because it is kind of sandier, more acidic, rather than just straight up absorbing soil in a lot of scenario or absorbing water in a lot of scenarios. It goes right through it and it feeds into groundwater, which are kind of like our aquifers. So yeah, it can play in different dynamics depending on the place, but too hot of a fire can also change kind of those little fungi on top of the soil or bacteria. And there's a ripple effect when that kind of thing happens.
All right. All good stuff so far. We're going to take a brief break. We'll come back to you on the other side with Tidal Flooding Talk. Thanks to the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, your flood insurance bills are lower and your streets safer from the reality of flooding. Since beginning in 2013, we build more resilient shoreline communities. Our member towns develop and share in best practices that anticipate future concerns and create flooding solutions. From our town-specific free web app for flooding information to our weekly Tidal Flooding Talk show, we focus on flooding 24/7. Visit www.njcoastalcoalition.com for more.
Welcome back to this week's Tidal Flooding Talk with meteorologist Joe Martucci. I am meteorologist Dan Skeldon, and we're joined by journalist for Inside Climate News, Kylie Price, continuing our discussion on kind of a multitude of climate disasters, weather disasters, and when they kind of interact with each other. Kylie, we're going to bring it back into New Jersey now. One of the treasures of the Garden State, the Pine Barrens, kind of unique. It's one of the largest, or the largest, Joe, right? Area of undeveloped land in the Northeast corridor, and they're very unique, both in the soil makeup and the forest makeup as well. Want to delve into that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. And I love the Pine Barrens, and I think it's a really unique place in the country. Um, yeah, they're quite unique, partially because of that soil composition. So we are close to the beach. It's a little bit of a sandier soil. It's also a little more acidic, and the water often goes right through rather than being absorbed. There are certain areas like bogs that it is more flooded. There are things called ghost forests, which I'm sure you've both heard of in the region. Yeah, and also the fire is a natural part of this ecosystem, and it's a pretty crucial part too. So some of the pine species of trees need fire in order to release their seeds. So, you know, we owe it to fire for continuing to grow this landscape in a lot of ways. It also, having low intensity fires throughout the year can burn off some of that leaves and litter on the ground so that they don't lead to future fires that are way bigger. So more fire in some cases can actually help prevent fire in the future and more intense fires. So it can be really beneficial in some cases. That being said, there is evidence that fires are getting more severe in this region and other regions around the country. And there are things that are leading to that. So a big one is drought. So I'd be happy to talk about drought as well.
Yeah, I mean, let's do it. We had what we would call an extreme drought in like the southern part of New Jersey for a good chunk of last fall. That's a level 3 of 4 for drought, according to the United States Drought Monitor. We had a drought warning in effect by the NJDEP. Plus, we had the driest month on record, period, last October for New Jersey, according to the Office of the New Jersey State Climatologist. And that goes back to 1895. Kylie, yeah, let's talk about drought. I'm going to just turn it back over to you, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, it's hard to think about that now with it raining so much lately.
Yeah.
But yes, this was a pretty severe year for drought, and that has a direct correlation to fire in many places. So in New Jersey specifically, oftentimes the government will run what's called prescribed burns. And these are intentionally set burns. They're very controlled. And it does what the ecosystem normally does, which is have those low intensity fires to just burn off what's called fuel. So that's those leaves, that layer of crispy leaves on the ground that could just light up, if a cigarette butt was thrown or if lightning struck or something like that. So it keeps things under control. This year, though, there were drought conditions, high heat. There are things that can prevent the government from doing these more controlled burns because they can get out of control if there aren't the right conditions for it. So there were fewer burns being done in New Jersey. And that can be kind of risky because then you have this increase in what's called the fuel load. So that's what some people are worried about. And there's actually another thing that can increase fuel load and play into this dynamic. And that's what we were talking about earlier, which is hurricanes. So we're going to bring in another weird component to this. You would never think hurricane and fire probably, but this is what's called a compounding disaster. And this is becoming more common with climate change too. So basically when these weather disasters feed into each other. So in this scenario, if a hurricane hits, like Hurricane Sandy, for example, when Hurricane Sandy hit, a bunch of trees were knocked down in the Wharton State Forest. That can be a problem if then it gets really dry and there's a lot of drought, because then those downed trees become fuel. So like I was talking about, we're trying to clear out this fuel because that just offers more ways for ignition. So we're hoping that that doesn't happen this year because it did happen with Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. There were several situations where there were so many trees that fell during that storm and they weren't able to clean them up in time. And then it got really dry, they dried out, and then they led to a fire.
I mean, it really is amazing, Kylie, how interconnected all of these, weather disasters can be. Because, we started talking about, wildfires in New Mexico and flash flooding from, say, monsoon rains, and now you're kind of intertwining hurricane winds versus drought versus fires as well. It kind of shows you, number one, how interconnected all these weather events are. And as you said, how they can compound and really exacerbate future disasters.
Yes, absolutely. And I do think for this region, that's the bigger risk. Obviously, we're a more hurricane prone region. We haven't seen it as much yet. There was a little bit of flooding that came with Aaron. I saw some of the aftermath of that, but not as bad as initially anticipated, I think. But yeah, I mean, all of these systems have different dynamics. In a lot of cases, in my reporting especially, I've found that research is showing that climate change is just throwing them completely out of whack and is just driving more and more of these situations called compounding climate disasters. So that's a term that climate scientists are starting to coin to basically stress urgency for these places to have a plan for how to deal with all of these disasters at once, because, try recovering from a hurricane at the same time as trying to prevent wildfires is a really difficult thing to do.
So, have you in your research for this or any upcoming research spoken with, I'm thinking like emergency managers about how they're tackling both of these challenges at the same time? And what are some good positive stories that have come from it, if any, so far?
Yeah, absolutely. And like recovery is a really interesting space. And especially as a journalist, I always want to try to be leading with empathy when you're talking to folks who are, just had their lives disrupted or maybe upended completely. But I've talked to so many emergency planners. I've talked to government officials. I think one of the biggest moves that people are making is basically preparing, like almost using it as a blank slate. When there is this disruption, there's also this opportunity to rebuild in like a more resilient way. So that's something that we've seen in the past in places that are more flood prone too, implementing these new rules. Hey, maybe you should rebuild your house not in this flood prone area. That's come up quite a bit. I also think getting in there right away. I'm sure you guys may have even experienced living in this region. When there is a flood, the faster you can clean things up, the better, because there are these long-term risks with things like mold, or even things like when there's stagnant water in places like Florida, for example. They've seen an uptick in dengue, which you'd probably think of for like a tropical country. But
Yeah.
no, we're seeing it in the US.
Very, all right. Go ahead, Dan. I'm sorry.
No, I just want a quick follow-up, Kylie. Do we also have to, I guess, as communities, as residents, as emergency managers, have to also change our approach from cleaning up of disasters? Like, the focus is on, all right, hurricane hits or fire hits. Let's clean up, let's rebuild after this disaster. But do we have to be more forward-thinking, saying, okay, we are cleaning up from this disaster. What if another disaster hits? Are there precautions we can take? So, I mean, do we have to kind of change and look towards compounding, possible disasters in those rebuilding efforts?
I think absolutely. I mean, it's time to be thinking about that. I think we've seen it time and time again. Hurricane Helene hit, and then what was it? Maybe a month later, Milton hit in the same region of Florida. So the speed and the support needed to help recover and help these communities that are being hit by this is so crucial.
All right, we're going to take one more break here. We'll come back on the other side. We'll have more of Kylie Price in just a minute.
Hidden in an abandoned as a mystical encounter with booze and spirits, where bonfires burn, shadows dance, and flavor favors the bold. Ghosts, ghouls, goblins, grown-ups, it's time to reclaim Halloween. This is Witchcraft, October 10th and 11th. information, visit witchcraftnj.com.
A champion with us in Atlantic City.
Welcome back to Tidal Flooding Talk. Us here at the New Jersey Coastal Coalition want to remind you to create a family plan. Every family needs a flood plan. Choose a meeting place, make a contact list, and practice your evacuation route. Don't wait until the last minute to figure it out. Evacuate early and safely. A simple plan today can save lives tomorrow. All right, so let me ask you, you are an Ocean City, New Jersey resident, at least part of the year here. You see what's happening in New Jersey. What do you make of our ecosystems in New Jersey in terms of the work, we've done as a community to make us more flood resilient, whether it's from, like you said, the hurricanes or from the wildfires or a combination of both?
That's a good question. And I am more of a national reporter. So I don't dive too deeply too often into New Jersey, but as somebody who does live here, at least part-time, I do see it firsthand. There was a bit of flooding outside today when I was driving back from Wawa. But yeah, I mean, there have been steps taken. New Jersey is at such a high risk because we get so much of this rain and this hurricane risk. And in some parts, the state is actually sinking at the same time. So we're having sea level rise and we're also sinking a little bit. So that's kind of stressful to think about long term. But I have seen New Jersey adopt these really interesting programs where in these barrier islands or these kind of strip peninsulas, one of them is called Money Island. There have been these buyout programs to help people who live in these places and maybe invested in a property and they can't seem to sell it because nobody wants to live in these places that flood every single week. The government has now stepped in and offered some buyout programs, and they're hard to execute. But it's encouraging to see an option for folks who maybe are ready to move to a new place because they just can't do the floods anymore. I also think there's a lot of grassroots efforts to keep get to know our neighbors and make sure that they have a plan, but also just make sure, hey, do you see flooding? I always look at, there's this Facebook group called Chatter, and I think these social networks are such a good way to stay up to date. And I oftentimes see people repost what the government posts. So it's good that people are expanding their access because I think for a long time, it's just a matter of there is so much information flying at you when a disaster is happening. I think having a trusted source from your neighbor can often be more digestible than some, highbrow alert that uses a lot of scientific language might be a little more difficult to execute.
Yeah, I 100% agree, Kylie. It is as an Ocean City resident, I remember being on an Ocean City, New Jersey flooding page, where they're sharing pictures, maps of who's flooding and when, and social media has definitely changed things. I also want to just follow up. You have the national reach. You have stories all across the country. Are there any resiliency efforts nationwide that you've seen, maybe in New Mexico or California or Florida or wherever, that maybe we aren't practicing in New Jersey and along the coast that you'd like to see kind of expand nationally, perhaps into our backyards?
That's a great question. Yeah, I do think there are blanking out a little bit on some of them, but I think one of the biggest things are these places that are getting better alert systems. This can be a mess when a disaster is happening. It really is a stress test, and on these systems that are oftentimes, in theory, they seem like a really good idea, but in practice, there's so much going on that people really just need to get the information and get it quickly and know when to evacuate. And there's a lot of research that goes into why people evacuate and why people don't evacuate. And I think I've seen so much of that come out of California. So I've done a lot of reporting on wildfire. And there's a huge risk in California for wildfire. So they've built up these alert systems. I'm seeing a lot of those grassroots efforts out there too. So for wildfire, maybe not as much for flooding, although there are these things called atmospheric rivers that happen from time to time in California. But for fire, there are these kind of like bootstrapped groups that are coming up with these alert systems that the government has now started using, which is really cool. And I think just goes to show that these citizen efforts can really pay off. But yeah, I do think that having this beefed up evacuation system and making sure that when it does come out, people are able to trust that, because there is research that shows that if somebody does evacuate too early, it costs a lot of money. I'm sure for folks who have had to evacuate, they've had to get a hotel, they've had to pack up all their things, which can be incredibly traumatic. But also I would lean on the side of not risking it. You know, it can be disastrous. It can be the worst possible outcome if you risk that. So I think just making sure that we're getting the right information to people so that they can make that decision and make a really informed decision is crucial. So yeah, I want to encourage people, like I lean, let's play it on the safe side and let me get out of here. I would recommend that based on what I've seen. Obviously, it's a personal decision.
Yeah, we try to do the same here at the New Jersey Coastal Coalition. And a lot of our member towns, you know, we want you to evacuate. You know, when we say to evacuate, we're not doing it for our health. You know, it's a tough decision and there's reasons for it. All right, we are almost done here. We are going to wrap up like we do every week with the one thing we can't stop talking about, tidal flooding or otherwise. Dan, you're up first.
Well, it is the, coming up in the last week of September. I will say big anniversaries for me this week. Number one, my wedding anniversary. So
happy anniversary.
It'll be 11 years. Thank you. And I purposely made my wedding anniversary the same date as the anniversary of Hurricane Gloria, which of course did hit New Jersey, and is my day I fell in love with weather anniversary. So September 27th, 85. Of course, big 40-year anniversary for Hurricane Gloria this week. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to go back to a story from a little bit earlier in September. Did you guys see this manatee swimming in the Shark River in Monmouth County? Yeah, I think the last time before that happened, that was 2020. So it's not something that happens usually. I don't remember why it was there, but it reminds me of when, Dan, what year was it? Where like the Atlantic City of water was like tropical blue.
I think it was 2015.
2015. Like, you know, who needs Florida when you got New Jersey, right? Manatees, tropical water. Anyway, Kylie, over to you.
Yeah, that's a fun one. I think what I'm thinking about is going back to local summer, taking advantage of having a little bit more space on the island and figuring out, you know, where I can hop in the bay. Hopefully it gets a bit sunnier tomorrow, but hop in the bay and nobody's around, walk on the boardwalk and nobody's there. That's kind of a nice way to cap off the summer.
Best time of the year at the shore. Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Can we put you on the spot and ask what's your pizza spot in Ocean City?
Oh, I hope I don't make anyone mad.
Oh my God.
It changes sometimes, but right now I would say it's Preps.
Okay. Okay. Is that a Dan Skeldon preferred restaurant?
That's me and my wife's. We there is the most popular answer in town. We aren't that we aren't necessarily fans, so we actually love Preps.
Yeah, it's so good. It's hard to go wrong though. It really is.
No, you're right. I mean, there's never a bad slice in Ocean City. Let's put it that way. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up for this edition of Tidal Flooding Talk. In case you miss Kylie, she's coming back. Don't worry. We are going to have her back later in the fall. We're going to talk about ghost boats. We'll leave it at that. We will be back with you next Tuesday with another edition of Tidal Flooding Talk. On behalf of Kylie Price and Dan Skeldon, I'm Joe Martucci. We'll see you next week.